Hello, everybody.
So, Pinky, would you like
On
to
behalf
start?
of Prabha Khaitan Foundation and Spectrum Ahead, I welcome you to this edition of Ek Mulakat. At a time when meeting in person is a thing of the past and we are confined to our homes, as a part of health precaution, one can't help but yearn for some kind reclaimed normalcy. Keeping this in mind, Prabha Khaitan Foundation has reformatted its activities to go virtual so that members do not miss out on their regular favorites. Spectrum Ahead is a ladies' study group who also shares the same sentiment. The Prabha Khaitan Foundation, the network nearly 30 cities across India and overseas, initiating various literary and cultural enterprises. We are honored to have amongst us today Lord Bhikhu, a political theorist and peer of the realm. He has pioneered concepts of multiculturalism and racial harmony in Britain. He taught at the University of Hull, London School of Economics, and was Vice Chancellor of Baroda University. Lord Bhikhu Parekh is the recipient of the prestigious Distinguished Global Thinker Award, Sir Isaac Berlin Prize, and the Padma Bhushan from our very own Indian government, and has written many books on politics and philosophy. To be in conversation with him, we have Lady Mohini Kent. Mohini Kent is an author, filmmaker, a journalist, and a charity worker. She is the author of Black Taj, Nagarjuna, the Second Buddha, and a cookbook as well. She wrote and directed the Ramayana feature film, Curry Tiffin, and is working with Sir Ben Kingsley and other TV commercials. Without much ado, we embark upon an enrapturing conversation of wisdom and enrichment. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Pinky. And it was William Blake who said, "No bird soars too high if he soars with his own wings." And those lines could have been written for Lord Parekh. He has soared higher and higher by dint of his own efforts. He has been described as one of Britain's greatest political thinkers of the 20th century. And he is a much decorated philosopher with a very long list of awards and a long list of books. He was born in a small hamlet in Gujarat, and his father was a goldsmith with basic education. And in fact, there was some doubt if the baby would even survive. But that's the story that he will tell you himself. He lived and he loved knowledge and he worked hard to educate himself. At the age of 15, he left home for the St. Xavier's College in Bombay, from where he got graduated and then he got a master's degree by 1956. But by then, London was calling him. And he moved to the London School of Economics, from where he got a PhD degree in 1966. As Pinky mentioned, he was Vice Chancellor of the Maharaja Sayaji Rao University of Baroda, and he's donated his library of over 6,000 books to that institution. So life is a journey that must be traveled, and I invite Lord Parekh to share some of his experiences with us, right from the day he was born and why he was given this name.
Well, you have aroused the audience's expectations, and I'm going to disappoint them. I wish I could measure up to what you have presented me as, but I won't be able to. As you rightly said, I grew up in a small village, not being able to speak English until I was about 12. And in that village, my father was a goldsmith, made ornaments, sold them, and that was enough to keep us going. It was expected that I would eventually, when I reached adulthood, would gradually enter into the parental profession and become a goldsmith myself. Well, halfway through the school, my headmaster, who was a very intelligent and interesting man, said, "Look, Parekh, you can't be a goldsmith. If you want to be, you may, but finish the school and spend 4 years in a college." So he guided me, and I went to St. Xavier's College. When I was in St. Xavier's College, my father thought, and I thought, that I should be a bank clerk and do a BA in economics. Well, again, I met a fascinating man, Professor Mathrani, who was a student of Wittgenstein in Cambridge University, Cambridge returned, and he said, "Come on, Parekh, that's too low. Why don't you do an MA?" Well, he prompted me, so I went to Bombay School of Economics, did an MA. And I was about to stop there, becoming a college lecturer, hopefully, by which time I met a very charming lady called Usha Mehta, who had fought in the independence struggle and went to jail. She said, "Come on, Parekh, you can't stop there. Go a little further, go to England." When I heard that, I almost fell off the chair. I said, "Look, England for me, a small goldsmith's son." She said, "Of course you can." She drafted my application to the LSE, and I ended up in LSE. And when I went to the LSE, I was absolutely stunned because I couldn't speak much English. There I was, talking with two people who had done 4 or 5 years of solid education, and again, an invisible hand in the shape of Michael Oakeshott, the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. For some reason, he took interest in me, nurtured me, and then the rest, as you say, is history. So there are 4 important turning points in my life, and at each of these turning points, some individual came along and helped me. And that meant that I came to see my life as a gift of others. And I wouldn't have been what I am without the help of others. And that meant that if I was true to my past, I must help others achieve what they have helped me achieve. And in a small kind of way, I've been dedicating my life to help young people navigate their lives in a way that I have navigated mine.
No, you're very helpful. You have helped me personally by mentoring all my books. And I know you extend yourself, and you just explained that your attitude was also partly shaped by your experience, but I'm sure that's part of your personality also. But for a moment, going back to the early years, because traditional societies tell us what to do and what not to do. And in India, we have the weight of, the ancestors is heavy upon us. And what gave you the self-confidence to be a scholar? And are we as individuals more valuable than society's rules?
Now, that's a very difficult question to answer. Why did I pursue the life of knowledge when I could have pursued any other form of life? And why did my life take certain turns? I can't explain them myself. I mean, after I had matriculated, I could have gone to college and become a school teacher, which would have been perfectly proper in that kind of environment. And yet, at each stage, it was not enough for somebody to push me into the next phase. I was myself inspired. When I went to St. Xavier's College, I was inspired by M.N. Roy, inspired by Marxists, inspired constantly to be arguing, talking, debating, and so on. And that led me on to do the kind of work that I did. So I think there was this kind of inner impetus, inner impulse to make some sense of myself and the world around me. And that kind of impulse meant that I could not simply be a conformist. At one level, I must thank my father very deeply. And he was a man who was not an authoritarian father. He didn't expect me to do what he wanted me to do. He had hoped that I would marry a girl that he would choose for me. And I made it clear from the age I was 12. Look, please, this is my life. I'm going to marry whoever I want. So let us not waste time about it. You can't convince me. So in that sense, the rebellion against tradition, if that's what you want to call it, was already part of my life. How it came from is difficult to explain, but right from the beginning, challenging traditions of all kinds in the family, challenging customs, was almost a vitalizing impulse in my life.
You challenge tradition and custom even in your marriage. As you said, you wouldn't, accept an arranged marriage. But tell us a little bit about that, because it couldn't have been very easy in those circumstances, in that geographical area, to, make your own choice and then go ahead without anybody's blessings or anyone being present. Can you share that? And I know Pramila Ben, Lady Parekh, she's one of the most gentle and affectionate ladies I know. I'm privileged to know. But tell us a little bit about that. What was the milieu and how was your it received?
I think it's quite an important question. I began to take one example of how I challenged a particular tradition while also conforming to it. And it took me a little while before I could build up enough courage to reject that tradition, namely untouchability. I grew up in a small village in India where untouchability was a common practice. The Bhangis would come, collect human waste and all that, and this was a part of life, that the untouchable child shouldn't touch him. I was playing on the street, and there was, by mistake, an untouchable woman walked past me. She touched me, and my mother screamed, called me back, and said, "Have your shower immediately." And I dutifully had my shower. But I couldn't resist asking, why should my mother's touch be okay, but this woman's touch requires a shower? So those questions were coming up. I think the other element was that to follow those questions through required courage. And that courage I could have simply because I could count on my parents' love. I knew that whatever I did, they were going to indulge me, they were going to forgive me, that they will never hurt me. Therefore, that love gave me the courage to stand up to them. So, to give you one simple example, but a very moving example which shaped me profoundly. One day in the early afternoon, an untouchable woman comes to my father, gives a bangle. My father was also a moneylender, in addition to being a goldsmith. Gives a bangle and said, "Kaka, I want 400 rupees." My father said, "No, it is only worth 200 rupees." Haggling started. The woman said, "But look, you must give me 300 minimum." My father got angry. He had been breaking my head for the last half an hour. 220, go away. He threw the bangle at her and went inside the house. It was his time for siesta, and he went to sleep. That woman, and I was watching all this, and that woman then turned to me and said, "Come on, tell your father, I need this money." I said, "Why?" She said, "I have a son like you who is ill, and I can't pay doctor's bill without this money. So I need to mortgage this bangle." And as soon as she had talked about his son, she was a clever woman, a son like me, ill, crying, needing doctor's help. I said, "Of course my father should give 300 rupees." So I opened the door, went into the house, woke my father up and said, "Please, 300 rupees for this lady." Now I could do that because I knew he wouldn't slap me or he wouldn't get angry with me. And he started shouting at me. He said, "Well, you don't understand what this woman is saying. She's trying to cheat us. There is no such child. It's all made up story." I said, "Please, she has a son. I know that. She's crying. You must help." And the old man then finally got her, opened the cupboard, got 300 rupees, gave to her, went to sleep again. And that woman, as she was leaving, came up to me, held my hand. She said, "I am not supposed to do this, but may God bless you and have a good future. You are a wonderful child." Now that experience of a woman, child, moved me deeply, and even now, whenever I think about equality, inequality, Dalits and all that, that woman's face haunts me. And that's how the idea of equality and the idea of some understanding of how inequality arises and dehumanizes people was planted in me, and my life's work since then has been on equality. So I got this courage, strange way, because the old man and my mother loved me and gave me the confidence to challenge me.
You've written a very nice letter to your mother for this book. And you have said, and this is for the Lily charity, which is all for women, and you're a patron of it. But you have said that she, in her own unreflective way, the way she negotiated the situation, her own gender, her position in the family, it taught you a lot about politics. So can you talk a little bit about your mother?
Well, I think I was beginning to understand when you, Mohini, are responsible for getting me to think and write about that article. When you asked me to write, I had taken my mother in a very simplified kind of way. Here was a woman who was subordinated to her husband and all that. Then I began to realize that life was far more complicated than that. So I went back to those events in my childhood, thought them through more carefully than I had done, and I began to realize that she was a very complex person. When Indiraji became Prime Minister, she was excited. And she said, good, we will teach these men a lesson, because Indiraji will teach a lesson. She was also very excited that women will now be recognized as equal and not as subordinate. Now, in spite of all that, my father was a dominant figure, not a particularly violent figure, but a dominant figure in the family, and my mother was afraid of him, as were my uncles. So my father would sometimes shout at her. If he didn't get his way, he would get angry with her, and my mother knew how to manage his temper. So she would know that she had done something which would irritate him, and to preempt the likely anger, she would already make certain moves. And those moves were very interesting. She knew that the power lay with him in the family, my father. He was the central power. But she knew that power was vulnerable because he loved me, therefore I had power over him. My brothers, he didn't love to the same degree, but they had some degree of power. So whenever my mother had done something which my father was unhappy with, she would say this to him in my presence, so that my father would be afraid of shouting at him, because I would then say, Bhai, Avunabhai, you can't do this kind of thing. So in this kind of way, she knew how to manipulate her husband, how to manipulate other members of the family, how to manipulate her children. And there were occasions, there was one occasion, when my father lost his temper, got angry with her, and I thought he was being utterly unreasonable. And when he was shouting at her, my brothers and I immediately jumped on him, pulled him away. You can't do this to my mother. So in that kind of way, the position of the Indian woman is far more complex than the simple patriarchal analysis would suggest. She is not a doormat. She has her own dignity, her own right. But just as in a slave society, the slave knows how to manage the master. And therefore, as Hegel said in a master-slave dialectic, the slave becomes the master of the master. But the master depends so much on the slave that the master ceases to be a master. That kind of thing happens. Which is not to say that women are fully emancipated. There's a long, long way to go. The purse was always with my father. The right to be angry was always with him, and he wielded a considerable amount of power. The point I'm making is the woman is never entirely helpless. The joint family becomes a kind of new politics. The joint family has its own politics, which resembles the national politics. And the woman who becomes expert at joint family politics also eventually becomes expert at national politics. And that lesson as a professor of politics, I began to learn.
But you also spoke about equality in the House of Lords. And British society is very different from Indian society. And Indian society is so varied that it's very hard to generalize. But what do you think is the position? How is it changing for women? And especially now that we live in knowledge economies. 100 years ago, it may have been brute strength and the world was a less safe place to travel around alone. But it's changed a great deal with the technology revolution. And now it's more about knowledge and mental strength and intellect. So how do you think the position of women has changed in different places? How far have we gone down this road?
And the position of women has changed in different ways in different societies. If you look at the West, it has changed in one particular way. If you look at India, where the starting point was rather low, it has changed differently. The other point I want to make, which is important, when we talk about the woman or the woman's equality, we make a mistake. We homogenize the woman in different phases of her life. Take our own society. The woman is a child, controlled by the parents, loved and all that. Then woman is a wife, woman is mother, and woman is grandmother. Now woman as mother has certain rights. She can, the same husband who have treated her badly, and as a mother she says, "Beta, ye nahi karna hai." What would the men, the head of the house would listen. In other words, if you look at our literature, the mother figure is a dominant one, and the woman as a mother has rights which a woman as a wife or a woman as a daughter doesn't have. That's one point. So the important, this is the story of Mahatma Gandhi. Here was a man who in history for the first time brought the largest number of women into public life. Sarojini Naidu and all those women into public life, thanks far more than Chairman Mao did. This was an extraordinary achievement, but you ask yourself, how did he do that? And he did that by appealing to their motherly nursing instinct, that the method of satyagraha suited not only men, but also women, because women could take care of those who had been hit hard in the satyagraha movement. So he appealed to that nursing role of the woman, brought him out, and the question for us is, how could the woman be equal, not as a nurse, not as a mother, but as a woman, in all spheres of life? And that is slowly and slowly happening, but very slowly in India.
That's a very good point about Mahatma Gandhi, because India is a Mother India, and the image of the mother in chains was a very potent image for the freedom fighters. So I think Mahatma Gandhi was a very great psychologist. I don't know, maybe it's in our blood. I mean, the Buddha was a great psychologist par excellence, I think, and maybe our heritage and all, which I think maybe we can talk about the education system. I wanted to ask you that we have, in 1835, when the Education Act was put into place at the instigation, to start with, of Macaulay, and it was with a pair of scissors, they cut off Indians from their very traditional wisdom of the rishis. And all the funds were diverted into English education. They stopped printing Sanskrit books. And it was a very obvious goal of the it wasn't the imperial government, it was the East India Company at that point. But how to control the people. And Macaulay wrote, a single shelf of good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. And it was a deliberate colonization of Indian minds. And I also quote, they wanted to create a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste and opinions. Now we have continued these attitudes to quite a large extent after independence. So you're a very outstanding academic, you've been in education. Where do you think we need to go from here? How can we change things to find a balance in our education system? Because sometimes it's quite astonishing when I see our elite anglicized classes. I mean, I went to a convent school myself and I was educated by Irish nuns, and it was very overtly Catholic at that time. There was no nod to the Indian culture. But I find so many of certain anglicized elite in India, they're very ignorant about Vedas, Upanishads, whatever, the great giants like Vyas and the others, the wisdom that has been given to us. And how do we find a balance now and our own identity in India?
That's a very difficult question. At one level, one could idealize the West and expect that the West is at peace with itself, or is taking a coherent view. It is not. If just as we don't read Upanishads, we would expect the West to read classics, Plato. How many of them do that? They all start with the modern literature and build on it. So I would say that this is the trend. Whatever is going, you try to link up with it in your own way. Now in India, I think what seems to have happened is a kind of half modernity. Modernity came to us through English language. That became the language spoken by people speaking different local vernaculars or dialects. Since English was the only language in which elite could communicate throughout India, the question was, what do you replace it with? Or if you look at the constitution makers, this has been India's tragedy in some ways, that our political system did not spring from within our own history, our own experience. We imported history. Now, since we imported history, all the terms are imported. They come from the imported language. Take, for example, the Constitution of India, or the laws are made, the way the laws are made, or the courts of law function. They are all in English. They are translated into Hindi, but that is not regarded as authentic. In the case of dispute, it's only the English language version that is accepted as authentic. Now, not an extraordinary thing for a country to do. Even in the case of the Constitution of India, only that version is acceptable, which is in English, not in Hindi. And the two are different. And for example, in English it says, India, that is Bharat, shall be a union of states. The Hindi version says, Bharat arthat India, Rashtra ka Sangh hoga. So in Hindi, Bharat comes first, in English, English comes first. India comes first. Now, important differences. These differences, in terms of their semiotics, are profoundly significant. The relation between India and Bharat is a very complex one. Bharat is history. Now, this is where the point comes in. When you talk about Bharat, you talk about land 3,000 years ago. The word Bharat has not been used about us for a long, long time. And even today, when you talk about Bharat, how many of us can say it without embarrassment? We can say, I'm going to India, but if you say I'm going to Bharat, it somehow sounds artificial. So I think we have reached a point where our consciousness is out of pace with the language. And in that kind of situation, it's quite common for people to continue to use the language that they have picked up. So when you talk about matters of love and all that, we talk in Urdu, because that's the language from where it has come. Mujhe tumse pyar hai, mohabbat hai, ye hai, wo. This is the Urdu language. When you talk about economy, it's the English language. So this kind of trifurcation is inevitable in a society which has lacked an organic coherence, and where bits have come from borrowed outside imports rather than organically growing from its own experience. That's my feeling, which is why I think I would have loved to have India go for a single language, and Israel did. Israel had this problem, and they said, no, we'll go for Hebrew. And Hebrew, rather the language, is taught in school, in courts, in parliament, in Knesset, everywhere. They didn't go for that. We hoped that Hindi will be our official language. We don't even have a national language. Hindi is not a national language. It is not Rashtra Bhasha, it is Rajya Bhasha. language in which people talk, but in which the soul of a country speaks. No. So with all these kinds of compromises we made while making the Constitution, and the Constitution itself saying that in case of conflict of interpretation, English version is the only reliable, you're already doomed. What is the answer? Could we have gone for something different? Perhaps. I'm not so sure. If we had gone for Hindi, South would have been in revolt, and I don't think any government would have had the courage to stand up to the protest that would have come from many parts of India. Or if it had had some courage, what about 5-10 years later when the new government came into power? So I think for power reasons, for reasons of communal conflicts, that was already there with the birth of India, it was very difficult to take a decision which was going to be so deeply divisive. So they decided to go along. And that's where we are.
I accept your point about the language, but what about the content? Because I read everything in English, but I regret that when I was younger, under 10, under 15, there was a lot of traditional, I think some teachings. I was fortunate in my mother because she was a scholar of the Guru Granth Sahib. She was a scholar of Sufism. She was a scholar of European history as well. So I had a very different sort of childhood, but some of my contemporaries got totally cut off from the cultural roots. Now, language is one thing, but when you know nothing about the Upanishads, you don't know the nature of Ram, you don't know the nature of, these great symbols, examples. These are some of the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, their morality tales. They're great teaching tools, but we were not in touch with any of them apart from the Sera festival. So the content of the education, and the Yoga Sutras are really about psychology. Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. All this stuff, nobody's trained me, unfortunately. I've sort of self-read. I think that's a big gap in our education because you don't find people in Britain who are not in touch with their own history and culture because that's part of their school stuff. And we, after 70 years, okay, maybe in 1947, there was not enough self-confidence and there was insecurity and everybody who was framing the rules had all been trained in London. So there was a certain mindset also. But now, 70 years later, what are we doing about redressing that?
Well, that's where the problem is. Once you start walking along a particular road, it gathers its own momentum. You have set the direction, and it becomes very difficult to change direction. So I asked myself, since 1947, what was a period when we could have decisively turned direction, or asked, or even raised this question and debated them? And I couldn't think of any, because every time you had either a weak government or a government which was interested in other things, or war, or the economy, so that once the direction had been set and the state had been given a certain structure, all you could do is to accommodate these local concerns. So you allow people to speak in parliament in Hindi or Gujarati or whatever, but nothing more than that. That's the first point. I think in terms of the elite is another thing. The elite has its own interest, its own identity. And the elite, while familiar with local languages, feels particularly home at English and would continue to speak in English. Now, in that kind of situation, what do you do? If you look at before independence, the elite was bilingual. It knew its own language. Tagore could write in Bengali as well as English. Gandhi could write in Gujarati and insisted to write in Gujarati. Panditji could speak beautiful Hindi and Urdu. All our leaders could speak bilingual. Today, we have Panditji's grandson who had difficulty speaking Rajiv Gandhi. He had to write it in English script, Hindi, to be able to read out his pieces. What has happened?
Yeah.
So the question, I think, is that increasingly we reach a situation where elite is completely isolated from society, and therefore childhood, kindergarten begins with English, finishes education with English, and is called the English medium. And with English medium, it's not just a question of medium, it's a question of what other interests they have. So the English films, English literature, everything relating to the West comes in. And so to learn English, Macaulay was right. It's to be brown, you can be brown in your color, but to be English in your heart. And that's what the tragedy of India. Elite has remained disconnected from the masses, which is where also, this is not the subject we want to discuss, but this is also an area where the BJP and the Hindutvawalas can easily capitalize. Because they can discredit the elites and look, these are all smart fellows who have no care for India. And you can go to the masses and say they're one of them. And that has its own risk. But that's a different story.
Yeah, but even at that time in 1835, because it was the East India Company and John Stuart Mill was in the board of trustees, and he criticized this English Education Act, and he said a foreigner will be always cut off, disconnected, and never quite will not be able to govern properly. So that mindset he was criticizing, which I think continued, and maybe we'll find a balance sometime. But I wanted to ask you that when you went to get the Isaiah Berlin Award, what was the ceremony like? And he talks about negative and liberty as negative and positive freedom. And now the pandemic has taken away our positive freedom to move freely and to travel and all that. Where do you think we are heading? And do you think we have to now reinvent ourselves in a different world? Because human beings have been very aggressive towards nature and other species. And now we find that we are helpless in the face of this virus.
Well, there are so many questions rolled in one. I don't isolate two questions. One is a slight deviation from the seriousness with which we have been approaching things. Isaiah Berlin. Berlin Prize is named after Sir Isaiah Berlin, who was one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century. Professor at Oxford, very charming man, talked fast, and he could give lectures, long quotations, without consulting a book. His memory was so sharp that once he stands on a platform for an hour, things flow, quoting books, as Plato used to say, and then a whole paragraph being quoted, and you can look at a book and the quotation was exact. Now, here was a man who also had lots of Indian students at Oxford. Amartya Sen was a student, lots of other people were students. The man who loved India. And when he came to India, he went to Tagore Shantiniketan, he went to Delhi, and then he came back when he was in England. I happened to meet him. And I said, Sir Isaiah, tell me, what did you make of India? Because I'm always interested in the first impression of people here who are here for the first time. He said, you know, every Indian has a different face. That in the West, faces are all similar. In India, each face is different. How do you explain this? Is it because the society is multi-ethnic? The different races have come? Fascinating. It stayed with me. Or when he says he was talking to Panditji, and he said Panditji reminded him of a Roman emperor. Romanish face. That again has stayed with me. And I often ask Indians, do you think that Panditji had a Roman face? Anyway, this kind of man, I very assiduously devoted to his students. He had read one of my works and commented on it, which was very helpful. So when an Isaiah Berlin Prize is given by Political Studies Association and given to somebody who has achieved a great deal and who is outstanding in his contribution, and each year it is given, selected by a jury, and in my case it was given, I think in 2003 or 4. The entire profession is present, and somebody talks about you, what you have achieved, and why you are considered worthy of the prize, and you were given the prize. And I got it. And you're talking about the atmosphere is good. Some people might feel jealous, saying why they didn't get it. But it was a good, warm atmosphere, except that by then Azia had died. And the prize was mine without being able to tell him, look, I bought something named after you. On the other question that you asked, which I forget now, the second question was.
No, it's just about these negative and positive freedoms. It's about the pandemic. Because as said, as human beings, we have been thought we were masters of nature. And we've been quite rough with the other species also. And now we are all locked in at home by this invisible virus. Do we have to reinvent ourselves?
No, that is absolutely right. Berlin talked about negative and positive freedom. That freedom should be understood as absence of interference. If I can't go to the United States because I can't buy the ticket, then that means that I'm not free. Or because I'm afraid of flying, that doesn't mean that I'm not free. The word free is wrongly used. It is only when somebody is holding me back with a gun and say, if you go, I shoot, that's when I'm not free. That's when the word free is legitimately used. And that has become highly controversial because it looks like a very limited way of using the concept freedom. And the pandemic, and I think what it has shown, as you rightly said, is this remarkable fact that hubris that the human species have shown, that we control nature, which in some sense comes to us. It's not a part of our tradition. It comes to us from the Greco-Roman view. Even the Greek view is not, there's a fate. Nature means fate, necessity. And lots of Greek plays emphasize the idea of necessity. You can't control, you accept it. With Christianity, in some ways, this idea becomes quite important. That God has given man custody of nature, and man is therefore the master of nature, and he can do lots of things. Now, with that kind of thing, the arrogance that nature is there to serve us, it's a material world. It's not even a natural world with life bubbling in it. It's a material world made of matter. And since matter has no rights, we can do what we like with it. Now, that kind of dualistic way of thinking of the world has brought about enormous disaster, climate change, all sorts of things. The question is for us to be able to recognize that we are not masters of the universe, we are custodians of the universe, or as Gandhi or others would say, trustees of the universe. And as trustees, we bear responsibility. We should handle it with care, not exploit it. And that's not easy.
I don't know if you'd like to talk a little bit about your family as before we move on to some other questions, because all your three sons got scholarships to Oxford. And I think they've had very brilliant careers, two of them in academics. Would you like to talk a little bit about opportunities, about your influence on them?
Well, that's a very personal question. And I don't know how I can answer it without being slightly self-publicist, which I would like not be. But I have three sons. They all got scholarship to Oxford, which is a great achievement. And I'm told it's one of the rarest in Oxford's history for three boys from the same family to go like this. So I'm really proud of them. How did they manage it? It's difficult to say. They worked hard. And I suppose I was a typical Indian father, breathing down on them and making sure they worked hard. Partly because I think some kind of ambition from the first generation immigrant gets transferred to the children. And they all felt that if they got anything less than a scholarship at Oxford, I would be disappointed. Not that I explicitly say so, but I'm sure I must have conveyed that impression that anything less, and they would be worthy of my love. I don't think so, but it's possible. So for all these reasons, they did that. They also worked hard once they went there, and two of them got first in the final exam, and the third one got an upper second. So there again, their own labor effort comes in for 3 years that they were at the university. So I suppose this is a matter of luck. And that's what I put it down to.
No, that's very wonderful. And it's something, you know, we are all proud of. And I think this is, there's some questions. We've got a few minutes. Others would like to ask you some questions. So I'll hand it over to Pinky.
We have our first question here. It's from Nilima Deshpande. She wants to know that, are you aware of a new education policy and what do you think about it?
Am I aware of the new education policy?
Yeah, the new education policy which was introduced in India.
Well, how can I not be aware of it? Because it has been introduced with a lot of fanfare. And Mohini very kindly made sure that I was fully aware of it because she sent me quite a bit of literature on that policy. It's too early to say how it would, but the essence of a policy is ultimately found in the way it is implemented. So the question, that depends on the kinds of teachers you get, kinds of schools you have, the kind of environment you have. So if we have first-class teachers, with a lousy school, lousy environment, no discipline, nothing would happen. So ultimately, I would like to see how they want to create the educational infrastructure. But as of now, it talks about principles, it talks about curriculum. They have a wonderful curriculum in which you teach Ashoka and Buddhism and all that. And the question is, well, how do you teach it? Are there books they can read? Who is going to teach it? Is the teacher as tolerant as Ashoka is? So I will reserve my judgment on the outcome of the policy.
We have another question from Sujata Khanna. She wants to know that, do you think the introduction of Sanskrit as a compulsory language from primary school can bring future generations closer to our cultural roots? Can this be a good long-term strategy?
Sanskrit as a compulsory language.
Yeah.
Now, even in Europe, Latin is not a compulsory language. It's open to you to take it or not to take it. In some courses, you are advised. If you're doing law, you are advised to have taken Latin at your A level. But nothing is compulsory. No subject is compulsory. So, and I would want to know why you want to make Sanskrit compulsory. At what level would you like it to be compulsory? I learned Sanskrit as a child. I can read Bhagavad Gita, I can read Shakuntalam, I can read Kumar Sambhav easily and talk about it. Now it has helped me in some way in understanding Gujarati, in being able to speak Gujarati with a certain degree of fluency. I can speak Hindi. But beyond that, it hasn't given me the capacity to read Sanskrit literature on my own. I only read English translation. In order to learn Sanskrit to the level where I can read the text, it's not enough to have it just one subject. It has to be a dominant subject. And that means replacing others. No, what I would suggest is that all Indian languages developed within the framework of Sanskrit. That's one. Secondly, Sanskrit embodies our ideals and vision of our civilization. Whether you like it or not, many of our noblest ideas come from Sanskrit. Therefore, it is important that every child should know something about that language. And therefore, he or she should learn something about it. But all the year from beginning to the end, I'm not so sure. What we need to do is to make sure that he acquires some understanding of Sanskrit. Enough not to be frightened of the language. This is very important. Enough to be able to cope with it on its own. And then we leave it.
We have another question from Ms. Tara. Do you think as humanity, we are ready to push the reset button and become more pluralistic and have an equity lens and truly bridge the North-South divide?
Now say it again, the last bit I lost it.
Do you think as humanity, we are ready to push the reset button and become more pluralistic and have an equity lens and truly bridge the North-South divide?
becoming pluralistic.
Yeah. We should become more pluralistic and have an equity lens and truly bridge the north-south divide.
And truly what? Equity?
Equity lens. The equity lens and truly bridge the north and south divide.
Well, I would love to know a bit more about what the questioner has in mind. I mean, pluralistic, which means diversity. We should be more diverse, right? But in what way? And isn't there enough diversity? And is that diversity in some cases not so deep as to allow us to become a cohesive society? So I would say yes, the pluralistic diversity are all valuable ideals, but they also need to be balanced by other values, other ideals.
We have another question from Authorized Limited. Lord Parekh, in your life experience and journey from India to the House of Lords, what inspired you in your darkest days and grounds you in your biggest triumphs?
Well, what inspired me, there is no such desire right at the beginning of your life which keeps you going. Not at the age of 5, I got up and said, no, this is what I've got to do. I've got to get, by the time I'm 24, I must finish my PhD and I must become a professor or I must become this. That kind of driving force I didn't have. Some people do. If I'm absolutely honest, I suspect one of my boys must have it. They had it. Because they must have felt that they are born in an educated family. They must go to Oxford and do a PhD. So each of them was driven by this, went to school, but always bearing in mind PhD in Oxford. They might have done this, I suppose so. In my case, one ambition at a time. So finish school, matriculate, stop there. Somebody comes along and says, but you can't, go a little further. So in my case, there is no accumulated thrust of an ambition that drove me. It was small ambitions gradually accumulating into creating this larger ambition of wanting to be a scholar. So with the result that I have only talked about my academic life, I think, but I have two other lives. My public life as chairman of the Commission for Racial Equality, or the BBC, or the newspapers, all my life in India, for which I got Padma Bhushan. Life in India, writing about India, thinking about India, about Indian identity, criticizing movements in India. So all those things spring from a certain desire to understand things. But there is no overarching ambition. There is only one ambition, and that is a problem is there, how can it be tackled? That's all.
Well spoken. We have another question from Ms. Shama Dev. Recent times have seen much debate on immigrants, ethnicity, changing demographics. How should nations be addressing this growing concern? And how do we move towards peaceful coexistence?
About immigration.
Immigration, ethnicity, changing demographics. How should the nations be addressing this growing concern? And how should we move towards peaceful coexistence?
Well, if I knew that, I would have made a patent of my idea and got some money out of it. No, immigration is a big issue and is going to be an even bigger issue, and an issue created by the West. Most of our refugees, immigrants come from areas that West foolishly and forcefully interfered, destabilized societies that were already there. And then these destabilized societies, what do you do? If my house has been destroyed, school has been destroyed, there is no stability in my life, I migrate. But I'm not allowed to migrate because all countries have closed their doors. So through smuggling. Somebody comes and says, if you give me 1,000 rupees, I can get you in. All right, I'll give 1,000. Why not? So immigration, legal, illegal, asylum, whatever form it takes, is bound to occur, has to occur, Morally, it is perfectly proper. They came here for 200 years and screwed us. Was that migration or was it not? Because they had guns and they could break open our doors, they don't call it migration, they call it colonialism. And the colonialism was meant to civilize us. Oh, for God's sake, what is this civilizing bit? You came and ruled over us and you took away a lot of things from us.
Profited.
You see, Tharoor is absolutely right when he talks about the British Empire and how the British completely dominated us. If you look at the French Empire, whether it's Mali now or somewhere else, or the Portuguese, or the Spanish, take all these great empires, or the American, which is a non-empire empire, in Philippines and elsewhere. You have done all this. You go around, you break up things that are stable. And then when from the rebel of that kind of thing, people fighting for their dignity and lives come to you, you let them die. The Syrian boy found dead on a beach yesterday. And without any sense of shame, I'm sorry, immigration for me is a crucial test of a country's honesty and commitment to human equality. In that sense, I think the West has failed. But the question is, how do we solve this problem? That is the big thing. People have a right to get out, right to go and find a home somewhere. But where? How? Now there are various answers. There can be an international conference. And the international conference can say, look, there are so many refugees coming, so many immigrants coming. Each country, depending on the size of its population, should take a certain number. India can take a certain number. Not a very large number, but a certain number. There will be a central fund given by raised by contributions from other countries. From that fund, money can be distributed. Which the Americans did in the case of, proposed in the case of Palestine and Israel. They said, look, coming to Palestine give up their claim, we will give them money to do this, that, or the other somewhere else. So I think immigration can be tackled at the international level if you had some commitment to human dignity. If you're only concerned to run away and want them to go away, this is what's going to happen. There'll be no peace, no coexistence.
Yeah, one last question from Priyanka Kothari. Since you wrote Debating India, what is your take on the debates move to newsrooms?
What is the?
Since you wrote Debating India, what is your take on the debates move to newsrooms? The debates which come on the newsrooms, the news channels?
No, I'm not sure. Say something about, since we are debating India, what should we be doing?
Since you've written Debating India,
What I think they're talking about are the Indian news channels and the very heated debates that we see with panelists, whether on any channel, NDTV, Republic, Times Now, and the panelists. And what is the question? Is it what do you think of the quality of the debate or what?
Because I wrote a book called Debating India. And I looked at the great debating tradition in India from the year 0 until yesterday and talked about great debates in our history. We have had great debates. The debates taking place now, I think, have lost much of the vitality and strength. And the debate today has much of fear. Fear of what the other guy would do to me if I spoke freely. Fear of what would happen if he turned out to be right and I turned out to be wrong. I mean, what are you see, big debates take place when there are big issues, where people feel passionately about something. Now, what are the issues about which we as a country feel passionately? So that whether you want it or not, you are engaged in it. And those issues are whether it is India is a Hindu state, poverty in India, our place in the world, India, what kind of India do we want? These are the big issues. And I don't see much debate on these issues. What you see is government producing policy statements, and then the country says yes, no. But the government is setting the agenda. There is no alternative agenda coming up from anywhere.
Okay, that was wonderful speaking, sir. And I would like to thank Lord Parekh and Lady Noon for engaging us in a wonderful conversation. And I'm sure the guests would have thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. I would really like to thank both of you all for this wonderful opportunity to let us listen to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And thank you for tiring me out.
Thank you,
I
sir.
think
Thank you
anyone
so
who's
much.
heard Lord Parekh today will be inspired and understand there are few limitations except those that we place upon ourselves.
Yes.
And thank you, and thank Mohini for leading the way and asking very specific questions, which have forced me to think about myself, my life. And thank you for asking questions, Pinky, on behalf of the audience, wherever they are. I hope they're satisfied.
In space.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.